Good morning, guys. Because the textbook is still not working, we are trying our best, and by we I mean our technology department. I'm going to walk you through the textbook as opposed to you reading it through it yourself. You feel free to pause the video at any time if you want to do some examples. I'm going to kind of cruise through this section. Um, because you have the ability to stop and pause and look at a screen and read it in more detail if you'd like. Okay. This section is all about midpoint and distance and finding a point between 2 points and finding the distance between 2 points. So we have a couple of formulas we need to know. First is the midpoint formula. When you're looking for the midpoint, first of all, a midpoint of a segment is the point that divides the segment into two congruent segments. So looking at this image, we have point P and point Q, and point M is the midpoint. The midpoint, you are going to average the x's and average the y values. So you're finding the middle of the x values and the middle of the y values. So you take your two endpoints, you add the x values together, -4 plus 2, which is -2, and then you would divide it by 2, and that will give you -1. And then you add the y values together. -3 plus 1 is -2, divided by 2 is -1, and therefore your midpoint is -1, -1. The midpoint is the point right in the middle of your two endpoints. And you could move this around, and you could see how the midpoint would change depending on where my endpoints were. Here's an example. It says find the midpoint of AB. So here's AB. And we'll find the midpoint between those two. So again, we want to find the average of the x values and the average of the y values. So we take -3 plus 4 and we add them together and then divide by 2 to give us 1/2. We take 2 plus -2, 2 plus -2, add them together, and we get 0. So the midpoint of AB is the point 1/2, comma 0. Sometimes we don't always want to find the middle of a line. Sometimes we want to find something like it's 3/5 of the way. So instead of finding the midpoint between A and B, I want to find the middle. Sorry, I want to find a point that is 3/5 of the way from A to B. Now this is a little bit trickier. Okay, we can't just add the x values and divide by 2 and add the y values and divide by 2. Okay, instead, we have to find the 3/5 of the horizontal and the vertical change from A to B. So we're going from A to B. Okay, the horizontal change is the difference of the x values. So this horizontal change here. So if this is 0.3 -4 and this is 0.13 comma 11, the horizontal change is just looking at the x values. So the difference between here and on this point here is 10 because 13 minus 3 is 10. But we don't want the whole distance, we want 3/5 of the horizontal distance. So we take 10 and multiply it by 3/5 and we get 6. So 6 is 3/5 of the horizontal change. We do the same thing for the vertical change. The vertical change is this distance here. Now the vertical change would be 11 minus -4 because it's the difference of the y values. So the vertical change is 15, multiply it by 3/5 and you get 9. So now we have 3/5 of the horizontal change and 3/5 of the vertical change. Once you find these two values, you can then add them to the x and y values of A. So we take A, which is 3 -4, and we add 6 to 3 because that's the horizontal change, and we add 9 to -4 because that's the vertical change, and it gives us the point 9 comma 5. 9 comma 5 is the point that's 3/5 of the way from A to B. Now, if this problem flipped and it said from B to A, you would have to add 6 and 9 to point B because you're going the opposite direction. So because it said from A to B, we added 6 and 9 to point A. We also have the distance formula. Okay, the distance formula comes from the Pythagorean theorem. Okay, at this point, you guys should know the Pythagorean theorem, but we'll review it real quick. Pythagorean theorem just says that you take the two legs of a triangle, you square them, you add them together, and you should get the distance, which is the hypotenuse of the triangle. So if you take 2 points on a grid, you can make a right triangle with those 2 points. Okay? And so it would be this value squared plus this value squared equals d squared. So the distance of the blue line is just the horizontal distance. And the horizontal distance is just x2 minus x1. So it's just the difference of the x values. That's the horizontal distance. And the vertical distance is the difference of the y values. If you take those two differences and you square them, you turn into Pythagorean's theorem, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Our goal is to solve for the distance so we can take the square root of both sides to give us the distance formula, which is x2 minus x1 quantity squared plus y2 minus y1 quantity squared. The square root of that gives us d. Now d is a distance, so it's always going to be positive, which is why you don't have two solutions here. You only have one. Okay, so this is the distance between 2 points. Okay, and if you actually had the textbook, you guys can play around with this image here, and you can see how I have a red point and a blue point, and I'm able to create right triangles all over the grid and use those right triangles to then use the distance formula, which comes from Pythagorean's theorem, to find the distance between P and Q. Okay, and here is an example. It says find KL. So here's KL. This is triangle JKL. So I'm trying to find KL. Here it says give the answer to the nearest tenth. I usually wouldn't have you round this. I would have you give me an exact value, like in a radical. But that's okay. We'll listen to the book. So in order to do that, I got to find point K and point L. Okay, point K looks like it's at 1, 3, and point L looks like it's at 3, -2. So the difference of the x values and the difference of the y values, you square both those and you get the square root of 29. This right here, for me, would be a better answer than 5.4, but the book is asking you to round, so 5.4 is okay. Again, I like exact values, so square root of 29 would be my answer here. Okay, very quick and easy lesson. You have two formulas. You have the midpoint formula, you have the distance formula, and then we can also use the midpoint formula to help us find points in between two endpoints, which is not directly in the middle, such as the example we did with 3/5 of the way, or maybe 3/4 of the way from A to B. Okay. You guys, of course, can pause this and rewind this as much as you like to review some of the examples.